All right, so we've called this the pathway to profitability, an illustrative example. And we'll go through a couple illustrative examples. Our goal is to understand how the strategic and tactical things undertaken by both the commercial team, the market access team, coupled with the ever-increasing pristine clinical data, and our efficient lab operations influence financial outcomes. We're going to talk about test count growth, reimbursement, both policy and collections, gross margins, OPEX, cash flow break even is one of the important things we're going to focus in on. Hope to deliver on that promise by providing some illustrative examples of the interplay of all of those inputs by viewing the different scenarios that can demonstrate the beauty of the financial leverage that can be extracted as we deliver upon the key deliverables. Program note, none of this is intended to provide specific guidance or of any of the above inputs. However, there should be plenty of color for you to have confidence in building your own financial models and be able to monitor the actual performance against our achievements in your own forecast. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Let's see, that shouldn't come up. So let's dig into the third quarter numbers to start with. Having a baseline understanding of the numbers in the third quarter gives us the opportunity to see how we move forward from that. So first off, you'll recognize the growth chart of the number of tests. And in the last quarter, we did just under 2,600 tests. It yielded recognized revenue of $783,000. And you'll remember on a GAAP basis, we recognize revenue on collections. So let's dig into those piece parts. First, a reminder of our two price points. Our suggested price point, actual price point is just under $2,500 for our test. If you look at the Medicare rate, there's a delta between the Medicare rate and our ASP of $561. Most of my presentation here today will be benchmarked against the Medicare rate. We'll look at how the test volume changed and do a gross to net on both dollars and actual tests. So in the quarter 2575, we did have pending reimbursement, about 30% of those tests. You can see 773, we were awaiting an adjudication, leaving the claims that were adjudicated of just under 2,000 at 1,803. We know out of that group, about 61% of those adjudicated claims were initially denied, and these were denied before any of the appeal process. So there's still hope for those to actually turn into cash through the appeals process. We'll talk a little bit about that. Out of that, 703 is the remainder, that an allowable amount, about 39% of that. And that allowable amount was 1,863, so just under the Medicare rate, which is really good news in that most of our tests are out of network, and the payment rate or the amount the insurance companies are saying to us we should get paid is just under that rate. So if you multiply the 703 by that 1,863, you get 1.3 million. Let's look to see how that translates into the dollar amounts. So the pro forma revenue using the Medicare rate of 1938 times the 2,600 tests yields just under $5 million of submitted claims for the quarter. We know that about $1.5 million were still pending decision, which left about $3.5 million that the claims were adjudicated. If you look at the denial rate, again, pre-appeal, that was $2 million of that, resulting in a little bit of a delta between the Medicare rate and the actual allowable amount. That's that $53,000 to adjust that. And the 1,310 ties into the amount previously. So out of that, you got 783 that was actually paid and another 527 that we are awaiting payment. That's the roll forward between the two. Let's look at CapEx so that we understand how we play with some of these inputs, how that changes over time. So in the third quarter, here's the various buckets of our P&L. You've got cost of revenue and your gross margin, and in your R&D includes your clinical research. The non-GAAP loss was $9.2 million. These are all non-GAAP numbers, so we took out the stock-based compensation, we took out D&A. These are actual proxies for cash in each of those buckets. We know out of the cost of goods sold, I made this point in our earnings call, that if we look at the delta between test count in the second quarter and test count in the third quarter, and we look at the change in dollar amount of cost and revenue, it validates the model. We've talked about the margins for the next patient in the door at being 90%. It's the consumption of the lab supplies that are direct cost related to delivery of that test. And the last quarter proved that out. The delta in increased cost of revenue above the break even represented around 10% of the cost. If we look further at the non-GAAP loss of what you can see here of 9251, 2.2 million of that is the management services agreement. You can see the piece parts of how that splits in the various buckets. And as you know, that for a large portion of the last year, PAVmed has been accepting the ability to take stock instead of cash. So when you reconcile that out, you've got a $7 million kind of cash loss, and the third quarter burn rate from direct operations was 6.3. If I look at the 9 months of this year, and you look at, and you can tie it right into the cash flow from operations in our SEC reports, the average burn rate per quarter is around 7 million. So the ability to get to cash flow break even is what we do about that 7 million and what happens to that over time with the various inputs. So we're going to explore 4 different models here, right? The 4 illustrations we'll explore. The first one's going to look at the impact of reimbursement by itself. We're going to isolate reimbursement, so that model will have a flat test count, it'll have flat OpEx, and see what happens purely by the changes in reimbursement over time. Everything we do is tied now to those changes. The tactical things that we will ramp up will be dictated by how reimbursement collection rates increase. And then we'll look and explore examples of putting the other inputs into motion. We'll look at a conservative growth rate. We'll look at a steady growth rate. You'll remember in the third quarter, our test sequential growth was 17%. And we'll look at that. There's no sense stepping on the gas pedal without getting paid. So as we get paid at increasing levels, we will drive test count even higher. And the last model will look at more of a dynamic approach to where all of these things get put into motion. So the first one, called a static model, as you can see from the assumptions here, if we put this in place here, the top left, test count's flat, OpEx is flat. We're going to look at reimbursement, and by reimbursement I mean realization or collection percentages. These are not covered lives, and that's intentional, which I'll show you on the next slide. We should be able to increase our collections as reimbursement policy gets further along, as our commercial teams begin to hunt in those areas where we have better reimbursement. So always the realization rate should be higher than the covered lives. So in the modeling that we're doing here to show the impact of reimbursement, we've kept test count flat, OpEx flat. We've progressively showed collections or realization from where we're at in the third quarter of 16%, targeting 90% a little over 2 years out from now. So you've got 5 quarters between now and the end of 25. You can see the line in between. We're going to focus on end of next year, beginning of the first quarter, in terms of where cash flow break even is by these various assumptions. So I will stipulate that it won't be a straight line, as you can see here. These will be many more crooked lines. I've added a line here that shows you that as the covered lives change, we will probably have greater realization in collection. Collections will improve with appeals. Collections will improve with the claim submission. Quadex is doing a fantastic job. We previewed the fourth quarter at our last earnings call by indicating that the fourth quarter, the first 6 weeks, were about 33% higher than the collection rate in the previous quarter, in the third quarter. So the key takeaway here is reimbursement timing, both the timing of cash collections and the timing of medical policies is not fully predictable. So that's why I say these are illustrative examples. It will become clearer as we move forward in terms of the impact. However, clinical data, claims history, and appeals persistence favors continued progress on the reimbursement side. And as you've seen here so far today, and we'll learn even more through the panel discussions, these are progressing on a regular basis. So if I layer in the test count, the OpEx, and the collection rate or realization rate, as you see here, this is what you start to see. You see net revenue will increase purely because we're collecting more of the existing tests. Flat test counts, greater realization, the net revenue will increase, and the non-GAAP loss will be in parallel with that. It has to be. If you look at this model purely by just the change in realization without increases in test count, you get almost a 50% reduction in your OpEx. It's somewhat intuitive, but the fact of the matter, if we just make progress on the reimbursement side, we can cut our net GAAP or non-GAAP loss by nearly 50%. So let's look at two interrelated examples here. They're interrelated because we look at the last quarter's growth rate, and that was 17% sequentially, and we can toggle that growth rate based upon the collections and covered lives. The first one, we're going to have a more conservative approach. We'll arbitrarily pick that at 50% of the growth rate, and then we'll look at that at the steady growth rate of the third quarter. So what you see in this example with the assumptions you see up above is the gross revenue should increase. It should increase parallel with the test count. It should increase at around 8.5%. The net revenue, you can see that the gap between the two as it exists today starts to narrow. And that's because you have growing test count, you have the realization or the collection rate improving over time, and those two ultimately should be pretty close. What happens to the rest of the model with OpEx being flat? The non-GAAP loss, you can see it should parallel pretty much where the net revenue is with OpEx. Now remember, the OpEx in the second and third quarter were flat quarter to quarter, and kind of previewed that for the fourth quarter that should stay pretty much the same. We have a lot of control over the operating expenses, and that expense increase will be dictated by how collection and realization changes over time. So what are the key things to understand here? Modest quarterly test volume growth, 50% of what we realized in the third quarter, illustrates break-even cash flow somewhere at the end of the second quarter, and that's at 8.5% growth rate. When you look at the cumulative burn rate over that period of time, factoring all of these inputs into it, that's a 5-quarter or 7-quarter period of time. It's about a $27 million burn rate. Pro forma cash at the end of the third quarter, you'll recall, with the $5 million we realized in additional financing in early part of October, is $29 million. So sufficient cash to cash flow break even in this illustration with controlled growth. Let's see how that changes now, where we speed up the test growth consistent with the third quarter. And as you look at that model, that illustration, these are the various piece parts of it. You look at the end of the next year, and this model will put you at cash flow break even. Again, steady OpEx. You've got increasing test count at just the third quarter rate. You've got realization increasing over time because of improvements in our collection rate. The cumulative burn rate in this model is $21 million. Again, pro forma cash being $29 million puts us in that time frame. What's the test volume? What's the realization rate at that point in time? That would be roughly 6,000 tests per quarter to get there at a 65% collection rate. Obviously, these are difficult to predict, particularly as the realization rate and the covered lives will change over time, and you can toggle them up. As the realization rate goes up, the test count to get the break even obviously goes down. So let's look at a more dynamic approach to this by stepping on the gas pedal, right? Here's the same model. The assumptions, we'll start to make investments in sales and marketing. The CapEx or the OpEx will change as reimbursement, both covered lives on policy and collections on realization improve. You look at test counts that are growing. This projects a pretty much slower during the first half of 24 and an accelerated process, and really stepping on the gas, putting fuel on the fire in 2025. You can see I illustrate the realization rate as being much more choppy. When you look at where we're going to start to make investments, the increase in sales headcount, you can see it's identified to that inflection point. Our goal will be to start to add to the resources in anticipation of that change. That change is going to be influenced by a number of catalysts, largely from the different strategies we're employing from commercialization and those that are dependent upon reimbursement and collection from third-party independent insurance companies. We look at a little bit further, when will increase in marketing spend? You look at that in this illustration as you have a change in the actual realization. There's no sense spending money on advertising, a direct-to-patient advertising campaign, until you have assurance that you're going to get paid. In this model, I plug it in here in the early part of 2025 to start accelerating growth. And what you have is you have a cash flow break even. Again, at the end of 2024, you have a cumulative burn rate for those 5 quarters of around 23 million. Pro forma cash is 29. The point is the range in the period of time we get the cash flow break even and all of those various inputs, it's a fairly narrow range. We're going to be reactive to those changes. We've demonstrated that physicians will order the test. We know how to toggle up the spend to increase the speed of test count. It makes sense for us to react to that when the collection rate is improving. And we know the collection rate is influenced favorably by clinical utility data, which is now peer-reviewed and published, the appeals process, as well as claims history, which we have substantive claims history. I think that's it. Thank you.